Dad and Mom got, mostly my mom. My dad, they got involved in it, and we ended up, in 1951, we come up and took over it. And we lived upstairs up here. This had been, there's pictures there too. This across the street where Howard Holman's house sits. And it was turned completely around. So that this side here faced Reinhardt's station over there. And there was always a door in the side. As a kid, I never could figure out why in the world they'd have a door there when they had one there. But anyway, that door in the side was, there was a canopy out there, and it was a hack stand. And the hacks or taxis, horse-drawn, would bring the people from basically here or the Rock Island, take them up there to the hotel, swing underneath that canopy, and they'd walk into the foyer or the lobby or whatever. And that explained why that was there. In fact, it was there till after I bought it, and I changed it, took it out of there. But anyway, the upstairs was a hotel and a lot of small rooms, hallway, and we lived up there when we had that. When we moved there, no kids today wouldn't understand, but no heat other than kerosene, and the upstairs stove. You didn't have a pump. You didn't. You 5-gallon bucket at a time, carried it up and put it in the stove up there. One thing I remember seeing Jayla there, her and my sister went to school together, and there was a back porch on there, which is still on the house, and a 55-gallon barrel of fuel oil set out there. And there was a old pop case there, and you could set the 5-gallon can in there, and there was a 1 by 10 or 12 set on top of it. Of course, kerosene in it, you know, and everything. And well, the home ec class, in their scope, they decided they was going to make baked elastic, and you needed a piece of wood. Well, guess what my sister took for a piece of wood? It looked pretty good and everything, but it sure did taste like kerosene. Everything you wanted, it did. But in 1951, why we were involved in the restaurant business, and of course at that time, 1951, no TV sets, radio. Not a heck of a lot of activity going on in Center Point. You had a movie and you had the band concert in town. Wednesday night was the night everybody comes to town and done whatever you want to do, I guess, or what you shouldn't do anyway. Mostly I done what I shouldn't. But I can remember the movie was on Wednesday night, and the old movie theater set right there where the post office is today. Great big old ramshackle building, long and narrow, wood stove with corn cobs down the corner, just get cherry red. You know, you had a cartoon and you had a movie. 25 cents would get you into the movie a sack of popcorn. And I remember Eddie and Eddie Serpasek and his wife, can't think what her name is now. Leon. They were friends of the people. These people traveled around the little town and had movies and cameras and showed that. Of course, this thing sat idle all the time, you know, the whole week. Nothing, you know. Popcorn on the floor. Well, you could, that old stove would get the glare, and you could see the rats and mice running around the floor. If you wanted to set your popcorn down there, you could have somebody helping you eat. You know. It wasn't a guy sitting next to you either.
You're ad-libbing now. I didn't see
Oh, yeah. You did. Your eyesight wasn't good, Jill. He was 2 years old. He was probably concentrating on something else.
What was so frustrating? Well, you're younger than I am, but what was so frustrating to me is that I wanted to get into those back seats where the older kids sat and knit, and the darn thing closed before I got old enough to move back. I never did get to the back one.
Well, halfway you could practice, you know. But Doc Bromwell, old Doc Bromwell, not David, but his dad, he always sat right down there in where the antique store is. That was Doc Bromwell's, that was his office. And I can remember yet today, he was a big man, pretty good size. He had an old 53 Chevy two-door. and he'd set, there was a little driveway right there, because there was an overhead door that went into the back. He sat right there in that driveway by that tree. And he'd open the door, because it was hotter than the devil, you know, and he'd be listening to Mr. Keaton, Tracer of Lost Persons, Murder Mysteries, you know, on the radio, WMT. And I'd been up to the movie thing and got over, it was 8:30, 9 o'clock, and come traipsing down the hill, you know, and I always hated that daggone bridge, because I always thought there was something under that something. So you'd come down there and you'd just go like hell till you got across and go down the other side. You know? And there was Doc, you know, and being a kid, I went by there and I went by the back of his car, and he was kind of half asleep, leaning back in the seat, you know, listening to the murder mystery, you know, and I took my hands and beat on that trunk, and, you know, he was a big man, but that son of a gun could move when he was mad. Before I could get over to Howard Holman's, he had me by the back and hell out of me. Well, then he figured out who it was, and he kind of apologized, but he got the message across. I never did beat on the back of his car. But everything in the cafe was, you know, Sunday afternoon, the kids, I can remember Jim Ashlock, what a character. They decided one afternoon that they was going to have a contest, and they was going to see how many sticks of double bubble gum they could get in their mouth and chew without swallowing. Well, I'll tell you, try it sometime. It's not near as many as you think. But Jim did have a pretty big mouth. And he got 16 sticks of double bubble gum in his mouth and chewed it. Well then, what are you going to do with it after that? What good's a big wad? Well, they had other things. And of course, 150 was a busy highway. We don't realize today, with the interstate, the amount of traffic that was there. And there was a lot of traffic, especially opening day of pheasant season. You couldn't get across the road, you know, you might be there 10 minutes. But all them guys, I remember Connie Dunn, Richard Polson, oh gosh, Ronnie Lyman, a bunch of them, they was all standing out there. So Jim spit that big wad of gum out, and the first car went by, he hauled off and threw it at him, and of course, couldn't miss, you know, had to hit it. Scared the hell out of that guy. He stopped down at the Christian church there and come running back up, thought he'd run over us. That made their whole day for him right there. And then one time the principal, his name was H.P. Maine, the old man I was called him Horseshoe Maine. And he lived across the street where Roger Thomas used to live in that house right there. Well, I don't know what happened, but they decided that they was going to egg his house. Of course, Dad, being an enterprising fellow, thought, well, that's a pretty good way to get a lot of eggs. So he furnished eggs at minimum cost. And they proceeded to throw the eggs on his house. Well, they found out what it was like to have to wash it off. And then one of the other things that they done that materialized down. A lot of these things happened sitting around. They always used to buy Pepsi, bottle of Pepsi, and then put a bag of Planters peanuts in it, you know, and they'd sit around and drink Pepsi and eat peanuts and try to connive what they was going to do. And there, years before that, I guess when my dad was in school, they had a strike at the school. One of the things that they done was they put a cow, a springing heifer on grass in the spring, down in the lower hallway. Well, she redecorated the walls and everything. Well, I'm sure that that's probably what motivated the situation was, but they decided, and how they ever picked on poor Ellen Dennison, I have no idea. I have no idea. But they proceeded to put one in his office up there.
My husband did that.
Yeah, I did. I can vouch for it.
Yeah, well,
My husband was probably involved also. And Jim
Oscar
and
wasn't
Ronnie.
the only one. There was a bunch of them.
There were three of them.
All those guys.
The boxing one, they got put on probation.
And it decorated that office pretty well. Probably not the decor that they wanted at that point in time, but they did. Anyway, there was a lot of things that materialized down there. There was all kinds of, one of them I can remember was Chet Werner. He probably he owned the Chevrolet garage, and well, he was relation to Irma. They owned a lot of, him and John owned a lot of farms and businesses, and Jess had a lot of houses in town. But he always ate down to pretty much all of his meals there because he was a widower and wasn't married. I can remember one time my sister and I, it was hot, of course no air conditioning, you know. And the bathroom upstairs was right over the eating part. And there was registers in the ceiling, just a round oval thing, and over a register, you know, and the register was in the floor. And this set down, well, just kind of over the counter. Well, we decided it was kind of warm, and we ought to put on our bathing suits and fill that doggone bathtub up about as much as we could and get in there. So we did. Well, you know, it was pretty full anyway, and by the time we got in there, it was fuller. And it run over and started running down the floor. Well, it dripped down little things. And if you ever knew Chet, he was never got excited about anything. He was pretty quiet and laid back. He just sat there and he had 3 glasses down there and he was catching that water. Never said a word, never said a word. Of course, my mother come over there and he just sat there with got a grin on his face. And she said, "What in the world's that all about?" And he just kind of went like, "Well, it put an end to that real fast." She come up there shooting fire out of her eyes, and that was a bad situation. Another one that ate a lot of meals there and really was a nice guy, but just was Louis Hand. Everybody, just a character. And I can remember he just loved my mom's cooking. And she, you know, in the restaurant, you know, like on Monday they'd have hot beef sandwiches, and on Tuesday they'd have pork sandwiches, and Wednesday I can still remember, Wednesday was always barbecue ribs. And Louis just loved it. But I'm telling you, of course his exterior was a little, to say the least, he sheared sheep. I got a story about that I got to tell you too. Anyway, when he ate them ribs, when that plate was done, I mean, you couldn't have washed it and got it any cleaner. And them bones laid in a pile, and they just looked like they'd been out there in the varmints, and they were just gleamed. There wasn't a piece of gristle or nothing. They were just shiny, you know. But he had that barbecue sauce over here and over there and everywhere. It didn't bother him. But I have to tell you, there was a friend of mine, Doris Westerholm, and they lived around here for a while. They lived west of Walker on Freddie Wilson's old farm. And she had sheep. And she was a very, we had grown up together in Cedar Rapids. And she was a very meticulously dressed person. I mean, you never seen her with her hair out of place. She was just like she stepped off the bandbox. Everything was just, you know. And she told me this story. She had Louis come out and shear a sheep. Well, the clothes that he had on could stand washing any day of the week. But he had a pair of Levi's and an old t-shirt that he kept behind the seat of his old truck. And I ain't telling you, they had sheep ticks and sheep grease on them. You could stand them in the corner and they'd stand right up by themselves. And there wasn't no way they would, you know. And he kept them behind the seat of his truck, so when he was going to shear somebody's sheep, he'd take them clothes, go someplace and put them on and leave what he thought was his good clothes there. But anyway, he asked her if there was a place where he could change his clothes. And she said, "Why, sure there is, right over here in that well house." Well, he went over to the well house, and of course she was a warrior. And it just had an old piece of wood nailed in the door frame that dropped over and shut the door. She was afraid that he got locked in there and couldn't get out of there. And she said, I thought about it, but it just drove me nuts. So she said, she went out there, flipped the thing over and opened the door, and there was Louis naked. And she said, "You know, I have never seen such a dried up, shriveled up, wrinkled up guy in my life." She said, "I've never seen anything like that in my life." She said, "And to my grave, I'll take that with me." A lot of there was a spare room in the downstairs dining room that is basically where my barber shop is. And it had two entrances, one from the kitchen and one from the front door when you come in. And that was just used as a dining area. At that point in time, we had a Iowa Electric crew that was here around this part of the country. They, in the 50s, you know, this is 1951, and there were still places around that had electricity, but it wasn't really good. And those crews went out and was, you know, just fixing things up, making it better, and all that. So they pretty much ate all their meals right there. Another one, I don't have it right here. I've got one over there. Harry Brookman's hybrid hog, later become board power, south of town. A lot of those guys come in. They had a big crew, and they'd eat in there. The railroad here, the section crew, there was a section crew that operated out of here, and there was a Rock Island section crew, which basically is where my building, truck building's at over here. There was a depot there. And they come in and ate. So there was a lot of people that just come in there and ate there. Betty Sarchett, who a lot of people know, was a good cook. When she went to work for us, she was a waitress. And a lady by the name of Iola Eldred. I'm trying to think, you know, she had kids here.
Margaret married Bob Kirk.
That's right. I was trying to think.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay.
And she had two brothers, Bill and Bob. I think Bob ended up marrying
Gene married Marvin Elton.
Pardon?
Jean.
That's right. That's right. Yeah, that's right too. Tony Eldridge's wife. But she was the cook at that time, and for some reason she quit. Of course, didn't have one then. And Grandma Flossie took Betty aside, and she wanted to learn to cook. Well, she knew how to cook, but cooking for 4 or 5 people is a heck of a lot different than cooking for 50 or 60, you know. And she helped her with the pies and everything, and Betty went on to be probably one of the best cooks in town. Of course, my mother wasn't a slouch either. She cooked a lot of, made a mean pecan pie, I'll tell you. Still does. But it was kind of like a family. Christine Falcon, she had Sandy and Joanne, I believe, was her daughters, went to school here. Sandy would have been between the two of us, and Joanne was a year older, I think. But that's the only ones I can think of. There was a multitude of them that worked. We was there from 51 till 54. And then they went down below, and where the ambulance thing is now, built that, and had a DX station, and then my mom
Your
had...
folks did that? Your
Yeah.
folks did that? Because that's what's been bothering me, because I really remember that one more than I do
Yeah,
this one.
yeah.
Although I remember this because I remember the Peshes.
Yeah, the fact is, that's who they bought it from. There was 3 or 4 of them girls, I think.
Yeah, one was in my class.
And they went down there in 54, because that was, if memory serves me right, I think that was the centennial.
Oh.
Because I remember I would have been 54, well, I'd been 12. And I got to drive the truck and take ice up to the, and I thought that was the coolest thing that ever happened. The old man done that because he knew he didn't have to, so pretty cheap labor. But anyway, they went down there and built that. Of course, that was 24 hours a day. One of the people that worked for him and got a lot of knowledge out of it was Dale Matheny. And then he went down below, and him and Keith Kennedy, they put competition in. Well, that, no man never did care for that. Didn't mind sharing what he knew, but when it was for the competition. But Mom run that till 1962. Dad didn't last there's Dale standing back there, he's verified what I think Dad run the restaurant for 2 or 3 years, can't remember, not very long. Ended up, probably the one that was known the most for having it was Bill Reinhardt. run that till he come down here and took this one over down here. I have to tell you a story about I worked at pretty near every filling station in town when I was a kid. And worked for Connie Dunn in the Standard Station up here. Gary Whitmore, in fact, I seen Gary just this summer. He married Beverly Gustoff, who was in my class. Her mother passed away, and they were selling out stuff at her house down here at the Central City. And we didn't have an awful lot of business. Why in the world there was two of us there, I don't know, but I always had a clean car. I got to wash my car off. And across the street, where Reinhardt's is at now, West Fagel had that. Boy, he was a worker, and he had a business. Well, we get along about 7:30 at night. We didn't have nothing to do. We'd done about everything we could do. You could sit back there in the office in the back and look out that window, and you could see Wes over there. He'd have cars 3 deep over there filling gas and running back and forth. We'd wait till he got out there on the far thing on the car, or the far car out there, and then we'd dial up the phone and call Wes. He'd run back in that shop and he'd get on that phone and we'd hang her up. And then we'd give him about 4 or 5 minutes more or 10, and then we'd do her again. He had a lot of energy. He could run back and forth across that. We tested him quite often. But the one down below this one was a lot of fun, but the one down below was a lot of work, and there was a lot of things went on down there. Here, once in a while, maybe on a Sunday afternoon, somebody would get into the Louis was known to, if you got low and needed a pint of whiskey, you could go there, and I never could figure that out. My dad used to tell me about that. That was bootlegging. There was no way about it. And if you was bootlegging whiskey, you wanted to make money. Well, Louis didn't. I guess he just liked the company. He'd sell her a pint for maybe $1 more than what he paid for it. I never could figure that out. I always thought that was kind of cheap stuff. Anyway, that's all you ever had. But back then, Friday, Saturday nights, get along about midnight, and they was full of brown water and had a lot of courage, and you had to put up with them all night long. One of the tough ones, the McAtee boys in town, was the toughest ones there was. If you wanted to fight, all you had to do was look cross-eyed, and they'd give you a go. Jim was probably the worst. Fighting was just his middle name. He had to do it. And I can remember down there one night, and by God, he just made my mom so doggone mad. He just wouldn't shut up, and he was just creating trouble. And she leaned across the counter and took him by both ears and picked him right up off that seat and kind of shook his head. And it just embarrassed the tears out of him, and he just shut up and he was quiet. But that was probably the only one. One of the ones that I remember was two of the gals, was Kay McNeil and Ramona Cole, married Leonard Cole. Tall gals, come in there with short shorts, and they was good looking ladies at that time, and still are, I guess. But there was a guy by the name of Herbie Krause, and he milked cows for Nick Hamill. And he'd work for a month, and then Nick would bring him into town, and that's when they had first he'd get a room up in the old hotel, and he'd just stay drunk for a week. It didn't make any difference, it was just that, and when the money run out, a week, Nick would come and get him and haul him back, and he'd go for another month, 6 weeks, and he'd do it again. Well, he was in there one night, and Kay and Ramona was in there, and he was a devil and just picking on him. And he was a little skinny guy, probably didn't weigh 110 pounds, wore ribbed overalls and a work shirt. And he kept picking on him. Well, then Booze was in the new cafe down there, of course, all upholstered, and they had a rack on the side of it, bolted on the side where you put your coat or hat. Ramona and Kay just literally picked old, what's his name up there, and just hung him right on. His feet was about that far off the floor. And his only comment was, in a kind of a drunken slur, is, "My, them ladies with big legs sure are strong." So that was kind of some of the things that went on there. Friday night, of course, basketball night, and I got everybody come down. For 25 cents, I think it was, you could get a plate of homemade French fries. Now, them wasn't bought out of a bag. Them was homemade French fries. You had a mom would peel the potatoes up, and there was a great big porcelain bowl that went in the cooler, and it set in a juice with water with some kind of sprinkling stuff over it. I don't know, that it's supposed to keep the potatoes from getting brown, you know. And you'd lay that in that thing and pull that handle down and then slice them off, and you put them right in the best French fries you ever had in your life. And, you know, people for a quarter, that's all they get, you know. They buy a plate full of them. Yeah. Malts, sold a lot of malts, a lot of hamburgers. The hamburgers, everything we had in the cafe, I can't remember them buying anything. Mom, we had the hamburgers, we got the meat from Pete Johnson. The meat come from out there where Squires live. Leo Notbaum. And Pete would process it, and we'd go up there and get it. Hamburger come in 5-pound blocks. You'd let that thaw out, and had a pretty good size ice cream scoop. And Mom, the sandwiches all come to you in a white cellophane or white wax wrapped paper folded over. She'd take them, and one of them there, 4x8 or 8x10 or whatever, just a regular sheet. She'd whack it 4 times so she got 2 squares. You lay one down, put the scoop of hamburger on there, and had a piece of railroad iron that come from over here, and you just squash that down, lay that in there, and that was your hamburger. You had them on a porcelain tray, and they was all made up. Butter. I bought butter from Wapsie Valley Creamery. There was a couple that come through and stopped and ate a Harvey and something. It's been so long ago I can just remember. But had a machine there that quartered it, and then you had the other one that went down and cut them off in little squares. You had little round white, like a paper plate things, and you sat there and put them on there. Creamers for your coffee was half and half, and there was just little round creamers that went in the tray, and you filled them all up. Of course, ketchup, you know. Tenderloins was, you know, you talk about Jonesy's, wow, big thing. My God, I've made, you know, Mom made, you know, buy a loin, flatten it out, and cornmeal, and a little sugar, salt and pepper, and roll it in that, and that was, you know, made then. Can't remember ever buying anything. Mashed potatoes, you know, everything was all, you know, just bought what the bare essentials, but everything was homemade. Colonial Bakery furnished the bread. They come every day, and went through a lot of stuff. There was it was a busy place. Noon was the big meal. Breakfast was, you know, it would come to it, you know, but you could get, and night was, it wasn't lobster, it wasn't anything like that. It was just basic comfort food, you know, T-bone steaks, chops, you know, cooked on the grill, right, big grill on the stove. And at night, yeah, Rick.
Can I tell a couple of humorous things?
Sure.
That tickled me when I was working. Louis Hand never came through the door unless he flipped his false teeth. And I had another customer that had to have a raw egg on top of the mulch. And the first swallow he took was a raw egg, and I just about lose it. And your grandmother taught me how to make the best chili there ever was.
She was a good cook, boy, I tell you.
Yeah.
Who had to have the raw egg?
Pardon?
Who had the raw egg? Do you know who it was?
Who had what?
The raw egg.
Raw egg.
Raw egg. What was the guy's name that had the raw egg?
No, I'm not saying.
Because I used to work at the Point Inn, and Calhoun, the welder,
George.
yeah, that sounds like him. I don't know, because he used to come in, and he had the craziest, he wanted a piece of cake, but then he wanted me to put milk on it. So then
Oh
it
my
ended
God,
up
you
being
mean you've
just,
never ate kelp cake and milk together in a glass?
oh.
Huh, you ain't never lived.
And then I had to mix him up, and when he was all done, I had to mix him in Alka-Seltzer.
Yeah, no, he was hooked on them. He was, I mean, he was just hooked on, he'd come in 3 or 4 times a day and have a bromo or
A
that.
brewing center.
Yeah, it was just, Mike?
Gary, what did the station cost to build? Do you have any idea? 'Cause that was
At that-
brand-
Dave Carmen built it. Dave Carmen, Richard Maspin, and,
Dick Hodge.
Dick Hars, yep. Darlene Squires' dad, Toby, or Jay Sanders, dug the hole and always made the old man so doggone mad, you know. That was at one time, well, it was a cornfield, back part of Coffey's barn, you know, raised where that apartment is, that was a stable. That guy raised standard bred and
That was ball diving when I was in high school.
it was a ball diamond too, yeah, yeah. And the only water was up where Doc Anderson lived. Well, the city wasn't into much about building anything, so the old man had to pay to run sewer and water all down the hill, clear down to the bottom. I think it cost him $3,500, and you heard about that till almost the day he died, didn't you? That back street, I always call it Water Street. I don't know what the heck that is, that one that runs.
I think it
What is
is.
it? Water Street. Well, a few years after that, why the city come along and proceeded to hook into the sewer and water that the old boy run down the hill. Whew, she hit the fan that time. I think he got his $3,500 back, and I think they was glad to pay that. But it had a base, that building had a basement underneath it, which was for storage, and the restrooms was in the middle of and they were big. And I can remember, I don't know if you ever remember old George Comp that took care of the dump out in the country?
Yeah.
Well, he was kind of an old weasel anyway. He'd come into town and he'd come in and just kind of bum around, he didn't do much. But I do remember that I was a kid and my job was every day was to go in there and wash them restrooms out, scrub them all out with water and clean them all up. And that was then they was way, 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 way too big, because I always decided if I ever had anything like that, it was gonna be just big around hangover, just big around to sit down and do it and puke or whatever you had to do all right there. Well, I had just scrubbed that men's restroom all out and had went back to get the scrub bucket and the mop, and there stood George in his bib overalls right in the middle of the floor, and the drain was there taking a pee right in the drain. I thought that was good.
Gary, you talked about the telephones, how you had 3 different phone lines coming in the restaurant, right?
Oh, you mean the old one down, well, we still had it down there too, yeah. There was, of course, we had the fire phone, and we had the noon whistle, and we had to blow the noon whistle. You had the siren down there, they blew them every day but Sunday. Why on Sunday? I don't know. Maybe the Lord didn't want them to do it. And we had Eastern Iowa artificial breeders, which, surprising enough, was some of Mary's, my wife's family that owned it. Their name was Perry. They was down there where Barron Motors is at today, off the interstate. That was a barn down there, and George, thought of his name this afternoon. It's Bobby Butchie's dad from Central City.
Carl.
George Carl. He was the guy that went around and done the business. And we had a list there, and people would call in. Everybody milked cows back then. And as a kid, I never could figure out what the heck, because it was AM and PM, and then it was what kind of cow. If it was a Jersey, well, then you had to put I never did figure out what that AM and PM was. But anyway, you had to write that all down, and then he'd come in and collect it once a day and go out and do his business. And And, of course, I failed to bring it with me. I think, well, it might still be out in my truck, I can get it. But there's a ruler that had Thistledown, Carl Suffering just dropped it off today and gave it to me, that he got someplace. It had Thistledown Cafe on it, and then it had DX, Heinz's DX station, and the numbers was, the station was 5611, no prefix. And the restaurant was 3411. I just seen that today and remembered it.
You remember Millie working down there for your mother?
Who?
Millie, who's self-returning to up here. See, was her mother.
Oh, you mean Aunt Millie,
Honor.
Arner worked
Yeah,
there.
she worked there.
And then
I
Aunt
worked there.
Aunt Alma worked out there. She's the one that lived out.
I worked for your mom in 1960. And remember when that tornado went through?
Oh, you bet.
I worked there then.
Yeah.
I met my husband there.
When in the tornado?
About a month before that.
Oh.
Who came up with the name Thistledown?
There, I never did get really the.
Muriel Pesh, who had owned it before your family did, had told me that her dad called
Louis
it
did it?
Thistledown, yeah.
Okay.
Well,
I couldn't remember.
someplace
It's
along
always
the
been
line,
Thistledown.
someplace along the line, it had something to do with the Leo Knotbaum too. And I don't know what the connection was there. Something about that.
When they bought it, it was the S&M sandwich. Myrtle and Shorty Woods owned it.
I would have been Lenny's folks. And there was, oh, you got that there? You just pass that around, they can look at it. There's some place, I can't remember where it is, I think it's in the basement, where there was a concrete thing that said something about them 1934. The Woods has run it for a long time. They made homemade ice cream and everything in there.
Well, Irma remembers that. See, I don't remember that.
I
You
don't-
did,
I
you
don't
told
even-
me.
We had, always had a lot of tramps. I lived right on the highway here. A lot of tramps, you know, I think they had our house marked. But I was never to give them any food. I was to give them a note and send them to Shorty Woods to get a hamburger.
And he'd feed, I'll be darned.
And then Keith would pay.
Yeah, but then we paid for it. But
Yeah, they claim that they have some place on the house where there's some mark or something.
I'm
that they-
sure ours was marked, well marked.
You know, when I was talking about those papers, those hamburger papers that we use, I still remember that. I mean, out in back, of course, you know, right across from here on the other side, we had a great big old wire thing. Everybody burnt their gardens and everything. And of course, when you put them on the grill, you know, that you'd leave that hamburger, that piece of celery or plastic or whatever on top, and let her kind of bubble, and she'd get juice and hamburger stuff in there, and then you'd rip it off and throw it away. You know, they carry it out and dump it in the garbage out there. And Howard Holman always had, towards the end he had bulldogs, the big English bulldog, but then he had St. Bernards. And of course, that St. Bernard would run between here, the lumberyard, and over across, you know, and of course he'd stop by there and that hamburger smell, you know, and he'd eat all them papers, did get all bound up, and Howard would have to take him over to the dock and have him all flushed out. Today I was thinking, you know, in the barber shop there, Carl saw everybody come in there, we was having a big BS session there, we just discussed all the problems of the world and everything. But I can remember one Saturday morning in there in the barber shop working, and a strange guy came in, didn't know who he was, just a new guy. And he come in and he said, "Is there a lumberyard around here?" I said, "Yeah." I said, "Holman's right over here, just around the corner over there." I said, "You'll see it." I said, "Oh, good." So it wasn't 10, 15 minutes later, the guy come back and he said, "Is there any other lumberyards around here?" And I said, "What's the matter?" "Why," he said, "that son of a gun, I wouldn't buy nothing from him." I said, "What do you mean?" "Well," he said, "he was working on somebody and I stood in there and he was busy, and when he got done with that guy, he looked over at me and he says, 'Now what the hell do you want?'" And he said, said, I wouldn't go in there and get it no matter what. I said, well, if you go back and talk to him, he'll be all right. One of the best ones we ever done on Howard, David Cook and I. It was a classic. The first year they had the golf carts out there. Dean Dennison, every year he, when he got cleaned his farmhouses out and everything, he'd have a nut fry. And being they had the golf course just started out there, everybody brought out heaters and food, and we had the nut fry out there. And of course there was some adult refreshments there too. And got ready to go. It was in the wintertime, snow on him. Howard had an old white Chevy. And he went to back it out of the garage or driveway or wherever he was, and I imagine it was just because of the glare of the snow and everything, but he missed the driveway by quite a bit. He ended up in the ditch. Well, I think Nub Osborne was leaving about that time, so he gave him a ride home. Well, David and I had rode out with somebody, so we didn't have a way home, so when we went to go, that car was blocking the driveway, nobody could get out, so we pushed the car out. Whoever it was that was along said, well, we'll just follow you home and take you home, just drop it off at home. Well, we got down to Howard's and, we still had 2 blocks to walk and it was cold. The heck was home. We drove it up to my house. Well, if any of you people remember Mrs. King, I don't know whether you remember Mrs. King, she had a very good reputation in town. And when we drove Howard's car back, why, we decided that, we just ought to park that under Mrs. King's driveway. So we did. And boy, I'll tell you, I can remember that was a Thursday because the next day was Friday, and I'm telling you, this old town was hot. And poor old Howard was the main brunt of the whole thing. And to this day, Alfie Stark worked for him, and to the day he died, and I told Howard, I said, David Cook and I done it. He said, you're just covering up for Alfie. He believed to the day he died in Alfie Stark. Another one that doesn't have anything but just part of I always worked down to Keith Kennedy's station. And honest to God, I really think I'd have worked there for nothing. That was the most interesting thing. You had Dr. David Bromwell, you had Bob Bowers, you had Kenny Opperman, Butch Wiggins, Alfie, there was a ton of people, and they come down there, and of course Kennedy was an innovator. He could create more, but he had out in the station, the gas pumps, there was a grass place, a little parking place in the highway. And I was working, it was a Sunday, just after dinner, and this great big white Cadillac car, 2-door, and when you opened the side of them old Cadillacs, the doors was about 16 feet wide, and there was a couple, I always presumed they was Masons, and she was whatever the woman part of the Masons, because he was all dressed up in a suit, she was all dressed in a big white dress, big fancy thing. They had this little poodle dog Fifi on a long leash, with a little pink collar around it and all that stuff. Well, the old girl, she had to get out and go to the bathroom, and she was a pretty good sized woman. He was about 90 pounds, about that wide, a little short, shriveled up guy. He sat in there holding the leash, left that passenger door open so Fifi could go out in the grass and take a poop. Well, while she was in there, Kennedy decided that dog needed a little help. Well, by that time she had come back out and just sat in the car too with the door open and her big white fluffy dress on. Kennedy went and got the air rifle and pumped her up and leaned her on the side of the door. When that dog got puckered up, he let him have her right behind him. And that dog jumped from there and didn't quite get through with what it was doing, and it made it over to her, slid across that dress, and there was the dog poop and everything on it. And of course, here's half a dozen guys in there just almost losing it. And of course, Kennedy just leans the rifle up and just stands back and run down. Well, they come to the conclusion that a bee probably stung that dog. But the bee come out of the BB gun that Kennedy had in his hand. Have I got any questions? I've rambled on. Anybody?
I've got a question. You talked about Alma Floyd. Have you got any good Boss Floyd stories?
Oh my.
What was the title of this program? Growing up in
He, of course, he was my grandmother Flossie's half-brother. Grandpa Charlie Floyd was a mysterious person. He had, well, my grandmother's mother died when she was born in Terrell, Iowa. And he brought her sister come back from, I think, Denmark or Finland or someplace, and helped raise, was actually grandmother's mother. And mysteriously ended up pregnant. I don't know how that happens. And, you know, they got married then and had Boss and Jennifer. And Uncle Ronald was, oh, what a character he was. My. We just talked about him today. Baseball games. Baseball was the thing in Center Point, Iowa.
Oh, absolutely.
It was, you talk, I mean, basketball was tolerated, but baseball was.
Baseball.
I mean, and they had not only the high school level, but then they had a town team. And it flourished. I mean, it was all over the. My dad, Boss Floyd, Nub Osborne, Paul Roseberry. I'm leaving somebody out, Augie Steinberg, which would have been Paul Steinberg's brother, which would have been Neva's uncle. They would go to the baseball games and just, one of the umpires was Dutch McCray. Oh my God, they could drive him stark raving mad. He'd want to throw him out and everything, all the time. And Boss was the biggest instigator. Just, you know, he could just, and I can remember family dinners. You always, you know, Thanksgiving, Christmas, blah, blah, blah. You'd always you'd eat, and then afterwards, you'd play cards. Cutthroat Clubbies, which was the game they played, and Punk Ashlock was his wife, Vera, was my granddad Heins' sister. So Punk and Boss, they was a team, and Grandma and my dad. And my dad could get pretty excited pretty easy. They kind of enjoyed doing that. They'd push his buttons, you know. And it always ended up in the biggest darn shouting match, and gonna have, you know, and of course Lawson and Orville, they was two of a kind, you know. They could just sit back and Boss used to, he hung out a lot up to the pool hall card room, which actually is down now as part of that empty lot. It's on the other side of the doghouse, and had a wooden leg barber named Peg Hunter. And my favorite story about Peg Hunter was Glenn Hoagland went in there one time and sat down in Peg's chair, looked at Peg, and he said, "Peg," he said, "make me beautiful." Peg had kind of a hair lip, kind of a muffled. He said, "He's not right, home." He said, "I'm a baba, not a magician." Well, Uncle Ronald always said about Peg, he said, they play cards and cribbage, and Peg would play with them. And he said, they finished the game, a woman and two kids come in to get their hair cut. He had a little place up in the front corner, kind of petitioned off, chair and stuff in there. And while they was pegging the points and dealing the cards, that peg cut 2 heads of hair. And the boss said, or something, the boss, he said, well, he said it took him a little longer than normal. He says that one kind of squirmed a little bit. You know, and you'd go in there and get a haircut. It wasn't the best, but he had Rose's red oil hair oil. And when you walked out of there, you could feel it running down the back of your head. He'd get enough of that on there, it'd stay down forever, you know. Oh, yes. One of the stories that I wanted to tell about out of the barber shop about Jim Ashlock. One morning, I remember Saturday morning, Jim come down early, guy's haircut. 2 guys was in the barber shop waiting. That was Wig Block, who used to own the Ford Garage in Walker, or Urbana, and Clarence Mullen. And they was sitting, and I was cutting Jim's hair. He always wore a flat top and always needed a haircut, never took care of it, it was always long. And I shaved the sides up and cut the top, and right in the back here, I left a great big arrow of long hair. Shaved him all up, shaved his ears, and he got up and paid me, and as he went out the door, I can still remember Wig Block says, you know that Ashlock, he said, if he had a scar on the back of his head, why don't he just leave his hair long all over? Well, with that, Jim went uptown, and the grocery store was, Scholl's had the grocery store up there on the corner. He went inside and got some stuff, and threw his hat off when he went inside, and the little old ladies was all in there doing their shopping on Saturday morning, and they got to snickering at him and pointing at him, and of course that put him in a real bad mood. He went across the street, Hattie's Tavern, the old hotel had burned down, and Hattie was in there where the Slim and Women things out there across the street, and Hattie's Tavern in there until they rebuilt it. Jim went in there and ordered a beer, and some guy got to snickering at him, and he bent him over the bar and going to bust him in the head till the other said, somebody said, well, did you just get your hair cut? Yeah. Well, reach back there. Well, with that out, the door had come down the road. Opened the door and come in the barber shop and took all my money out of my cash drawer and left. I didn't come back, but he did tell me, he said, you know, one of these days I'm going to get you. And that wasn't a very good thing, because I think he pretty well meant what he said. So one day, hot day, and a couple months later in the summer, and I laid down, or kind of relaxing there in the barber chair and fell asleep. Well, when I woke up, went to get up out of the chair and couldn't do it. I was handcuffed to the rail of the chair. And I didn't think much of them handcuffs. I thought a guy could probably get up and, but you know, you kind of move around a little with them, they get pretty snug before you get out of it. Well, come to find out here a little later, about half an hour they left me there, had 3 or 4 people waiting. Pretty hard to cut hair with one hand there. In come, they come in there, you know, and it was Dave Floyd. He was a deputy sheriff then, and he thought that was a pretty doggone good idea. And he got even, you know. I didn't do it again to him. I left him out. I'm pretty run out of things to say. If anybody doesn't have any questions, I don't know.
Gary, what about describing what it looked like in, you know?
The interior?
Yeah.
Well, the inside, as you come in, you walked in through the front door, and then, of course, you had this way over here went in, there was a door went into the barber shop, and then you had to turn, and you went into the interior of the cafe. Well, right on the very corner there was the counter where the cash register was, and back in the corner there still is, there's a closet in there, and cigarettes and all that kind of stuff like that was put in there, and candy was in, you know, we had a counter, case there with glass in it. And then you went straight ahead, you went into the kitchen, which the kitchen is still basically like it is today in that house. And then the counter run, come back this way along the length of it, and the booths were along the south wall and along the, a couple, I think it might, no, I don't think, it might have been one on the west wall, but there was an old Wurlitzer jukebox, the one with the bubbles in it and all that stuff, and you didn't have people going around and selling, or, you know, you watch your mom and go down to Neisner's and Woolworths and buy records, you know, and you put them in yourself, still got a lot of them. And they were 78s, they were the great big old ones. And there was 2 windows along there was a wall that separated the eating part from the restaurant part, and there was 2 windows in there. One had glass shelves in it, and that's where they set the pies and stuff. And the other one was right in front of the steam table where you served, your mashed potatoes and all that kind of stuff was there, and they set it up on there. And then there was a little restroom. I got to think about that today. That wouldn't float today. It was one restroom, everybody used the same. It wasn't very fancy. The floor, you didn't have fancy floor. It was just sheets of basically underlayment that they use today. That's what you use today. And it was all put in with screws, big heavy screws. I can't imagine that all would be done by hand because there wasn't any night wherever that was. That Pesh he was quite a builder and quite an inventor. He had a refrigeration business trade before they come into that. Had built a dishwasher at that time, which didn't last very long. I become the dishwasher. Not real fancy decor. Nobody spent a ton of money on it. Pretty low maintenance,
What about upstairs?
Well, the upstairs there was 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 bedrooms upstairs and a bath. At the far south end was the bath. Hallway run north and south, and rooms were east and west. On the west side there was 3 rooms. A change room or a closet room or whatever, like a wardrobe. That was right off the bathroom. And
Yeah.
I think it was 1962 that,
And did the dissolute name go on, didn't it, for a while?
I think Hallie, Marion, when Mom quit, Marion Straight.
Had 3 or 4 operators right
Yeah, she had it, Hallie had it, I don't remember who had it.
there. Yellow was the last yellow.
Well, Dell, yeah, but I think when Marion and Hattie had it, I think it was still Thistle Duke Buffet. Dell changed the name,
Yeah.
and then it changed several times after that.
Okay. Thanks.
Yeah. Anybody else? I think I'm done. I've bullshitted with the deal.
I assure you, everything Gary told you is true.
Guaranteed. Guaranteed.
How much did you pay you to say that?
Kind of like my dad, I always enjoyed him a lot. He was a character. But I've heard him tell 1,000,000 stories in my time. And being a trucker, which he was, that was his main thing. Travel a lot all over the world, or the United States anyway. And I've heard him tell the same stories 100 times. But he never told the son of a gun that St. Winkle.
Thank you, Gary. I don't want anybody to get away before we do some advertising here. We have next Sunday, country school reunion at 2 o'clock here, so anybody